July 21, 1944. A U.S. Navy contract sat on a desk in Washington, and it was about to be canceled. The airplane behind it, the Douglas SBD-1 destroyer, had grown too heavy, too slow, too late for the war it was built to fight. 2 men in the cockpit, an internal bomb bay eating up structural weight, and a performance sheet the Bureau of Aeronautics no longer wanted to sign off on. Douglas had one shot to save the program before the Navy walked away entirely. The man they called into that room had never flown a combat mission in his life. He had never dropped a bomb, never sat behind the stick of a fighter in anger, never worn a Navy flight suit. He was an engineer, and by the next morning in a Washington hotel room, he was about to throw out everything the U.S. Navy thought it knew about carrier attack aircraft and start over from a blank sheet of paper. His name was Ed Heinemann. Before we dive in, subscribe and tell me in one sentence where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment. In 1944, every naval aviator, every Bureau of Aeronautics engineer, every rival design team accepted the same ceiling. A carrier attack aircraft needed 2 men, a pilot up front and a bombardier or gunner behind him, and it needed an internal bay to carry its ordnance close to the fuselage, shielded from drag. That was the formula behind the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. It was the formula behind the Grumman TBF Avenger. It was the formula the failing BTD-1 itself had been built on. 2 crew, 1 bay, and a weight penalty. Everyone simply accepted as the cost of doing business on a flight deck. Feel what that penalty actually cost. Every extra man was extra weight the right radial engine had to drag off a pitching carrier deck. Every internal bay was drag the airframe carried on every single sortie, whether it was loaded or empty. Range shrank. Rate of climb shrank. And in the summer of 1944, with the war in the Pacific still grinding forward, the Navy needed an attack aircraft that could outfly, outlift, and outlast anything the enemy could put in the air, not one more design built around a formula that was already failing on the drawing board in front of them. Every competent engineer in the country looked at those numbers and accepted them as fixed. One man looked at the same failing airplane and saw a way through. His name was Ed Heinemann. He was 36. He had never been the man anyone in the industry expected to redesign naval doctrine from scratch. For most of his career, he had been the engineer nobody bet on. Not the Ivy League graduate, not the credentialed prodigy handed a drafting table and a corner office. He was self-taught, and self-taught men in American aviation in the 1920s did not usually end up rewriting the rules. They usually ended up unemployed. He was born on March 14, 1908, in Saginaw, Michigan, and moved to California as a small boy, raised in the sprawl of Los Angeles at a time when the city's aviation industry barely existed yet. There was no engineering degree behind his name. What he had instead was a habit of teaching himself whatever the job in front of him demanded, and the nerve to walk into rooms he had no formal right to be in. In 1926, at 18 years old, he joined Douglas Aircraft as a draftsman. He lasted less than a year before he was laid off. Picture that for a moment, an 18-year-old with no degree, cut loose from the one aviation company that would one day put his name on more than 20 combat aircraft, sent back out to find work in an industry that barely had room for him the first time. He didn't stay out of the cockpit of the industry for long. He moved through International Aircraft, then to Moreland Aircraft, where he became chief engineer, and where he did something almost nobody with his job title did. He tested his own designs himself. In 1929, when Moreland needed to know whether the M1 trainer, a braced-wing parasol monoplane he had drawn up, would actually fly the way his numbers said it would, Heinemann didn't hand the airplane to a professional test pilot and wait for a report. He got in and flew it himself. That single decision tells you almost everything about the engineer he would become. He trusted his own math enough to put his body inside it. In 1930, he joined Northrop Corporation as a project engineer, and 6 years later, when Douglas acquired Northrop's operations, Heinemann came back through the same doors that had let him go a decade earlier. This time, the company that had once laid him off within a year made him chief engineer. He was 28 years old. Have you ever gone back to the place that rejected you first and made them regret ever letting you walk out the door? By 1936, the draftsman nobody expected to keep was running engineering for one of the largest aircraft manufacturers in the country. He had no pedigree, no formal design degree, no institutional pull. What he had was 8 years of being underestimated, and a habit, learned the hard way, of proving every doubt wrong with a finished airplane instead of an argument. He would spend the next 24 years at Douglas building exactly that kind of proof, one aircraft at a time. The SBD Dauntless came first, the dive bomber that would help decide the Battle of Midway. Then came the A-20 and A-26 attack bombers, built by the thousands. Heinemann's engineering philosophy hardened into something almost stubborn across those programs. Strip every unnecessary pound, question every assumed requirement, and never let tradition dictate a design decision that the physics didn't actually demand. That philosophy made him valuable. It also made him, by the reputation he earned inside Douglas, difficult. Engineers under him told stories of design reviews where Heinemann would look at a component nobody had questioned in a decade and simply ask why it was still there. Not because he enjoyed friction, because he had learned, as a fired 18-year-old draftsman, that nothing about a career in this industry was owed to you. You built the case for your own airplane, in metal, or you didn't build it at all. By the summer of 1944, Heinemann had been chief engineer at Douglas for 8 years. I had a reputation for ruthless simplification and a track record of aircraft that flew, fought, and came home. What he did not have yet was the airplane that would outlive every jet the Navy and Air Force would try to replace it with for the next 3 decades. That airplane was about to walk in the door disguised as a failure. The Bureau of Aeronautics was losing patience with the BTD-1 destroyer, Douglas's current answer to the Navy's need for a heavy carrier attack aircraft. It was overweight. It was underperforming, and by the middle of 1944, the Navy was close to canceling it outright, which would have meant Douglas walking away from the carrier attack contract entirely, mid-war, at the worst possible moment to lose Navy confidence. Heinemann was about to get the call that would define the rest of his career, and the phone hadn't even rung yet. The call came from the Bureau of Aeronautics in June of 1944, and it wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. The Navy had seen enough of the BTD-1 destroyer's performance numbers to know the program was failing, and Douglas's representatives were summoned to Washington to explain what, if anything, could be salvaged. The technical problem on the table was brutally specific. The BTD-1 carried a 2-man crew and an internal bomb bay, and both of those choices were bleeding away the performance the Navy actually needed on a carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific War. Range, rate of climb, ordnance load, and the simple ability to get off a flight deck fully loaded without struggling for altitude. The airplane wasn't a minor miscalculation. It was built on assumptions the war no longer had time for. Heinemann didn't walk into that Washington hotel room to defend the BTD-1. He walked in to kill it and replace it with something that hadn't existed that morning. Working through the night with Leo Devlin and Gene Root, he stripped the design down to its most basic military requirement, a carrier aircraft that could carry a heavy weapons load a long distance and survive doing it, and rebuilt it around a single pilot, one enormous radial engine, and hardpoints slung outside the fuselage instead of a bay carved into it. Every choice he made that night was the same choice he'd been making since his first design reviews at Moreland. If a requirement wasn't load-bearing, it didn't survive the redesign. This was Heinemann's design philosophy distilled into a single night's work. Not innovation for its own sake, subtraction. Take away everything the airframe didn't strictly need to do its job, and what's left will outfly anything still carrying the weight of assumptions nobody bothered to question. I was 36 years old, 8 years into running engineering at one of the country's largest aircraft manufacturers, and he had just spent one sleepless night redrawing the entire future of American naval attack aviation on hotel stationery. The Bureau of Aeronautics didn't need to be convinced twice. Within weeks, Douglas had a new contract, a new designation, and a deadline that would have broken most design teams before they ever reached a prototype. The door that opened in that Washington hotel room in the summer of 1944 would not close again. Not for Heinemann, not for Douglas, and not for the United States military, which was about to receive an airplane it would still be flying in combat 23 years later. What came out of that all-night session in the Washington hotel room, reportedly sketched on nothing more than stationery and adrenaline, was a design the Navy designated the XBT-2D1, and Douglas engineers privately nicknamed it the the Dauntless II, an unofficial nod to the dive bomber that had already made Heinemann's name. The proposal went to the Bureau of Aeronautics on July 6, 1944. Prototypes were ordered before the ink was dry. The mock-up was complete by August. The design team had weeks, not years, and every decision from that point forward was made under a deadline the war itself had set. Once the basic concept was locked, Heinemann turned his engineers loose on a single obsession: weight. A Navy study had shown that for every 100 pounds stripped from the airframe, the takeoff run shortened by 8 feet, the combat radius grew by 22 miles, and the rate of climb improved by 18 feet per minute. Heinemann treated those numbers as a mandate, not a suggestion. The fuel system reduced 270 pounds through simplification. The internal bomb bay eliminated entirely, its 200 pounds gone. Its ordnance now hung externally on hardpoints beneath the wings and fuselage instead. The dive brake moved to the fuselage itself, a 70-pound saving. Even the tail wheel was swapped for an older, simpler design, shaving another 100 pounds off an airframe that had already been cut to the bone. Total weight removed from the original XBT-2D1 concept, more than 1,800 pounds, weight that became range, climb rate, and payload the Navy could put to work in combat. Single-seat carrier attack aircraft, one pilot flying and fighting alone, with no bombardier or gunner behind him to share the workload or the risk. Internal bomb bay eliminated. Ordnance carried externally on hardpoints instead of tucked inside the fuselage, trading a small amount of aerodynamic cleanliness for a design that could be reconfigured for almost any mission the Navy threw at it. Every technical choice Heinemann made was a direct rejection of the two-man internal bay formula the entire industry had accepted as fixed just months earlier. The Bureau of Aeronautics wasn't uniformly convinced. A single-seat attack aircraft asking one pilot to navigate, aim, and fight alone struck some naval aviators as a step backward, a return to something closer to a fighter than the crewed attack bomber doctrine the fleet had built its Pacific campaign around. The objection wasn't unreasonable. A second man in the cockpit had always meant a second set of eyes on navigation, a second set of hands on the guns, a second chance if the pilot went down. Heinemann was asking the Navy to trust one man, one engine, and one airframe stripped of every redundancy the fleet had come to rely on. But the numbers Heinemann's team was generating made the argument for him faster than any meeting could. Stripped of nearly a ton of unnecessary weight, the XBT-2D1 could climb faster than the two-man aircraft it was replacing. It could fly farther on the same fuel load, and with ordnance hung externally instead of buried in an internal bay, it could be reconfigured on the flight deck for almost any mission profile the Navy needed. Dive bombing, torpedo runs, close support, without a redesign. The prototype was ready to fly less than 9 months after that hotel room conversation. On March 18, 1945, the XBT-2D1 took to the air for the first time nearly 4 months ahead of the schedule the Bureau of Aeronautics had set. In an industry where wartime deadlines routinely slipped by months, Heinemann's stripped-down, single-seat, externally armed attack aircraft had done the opposite. The Navy that had been ready to cancel a failing two-man bomber just months earlier now had a single-seat replacement flying ahead of schedule, carrying more, climbing faster, and doing it with fewer moving parts and fewer bodies at risk per sortie. The engineers who had doubted a one-man attack aircraft did not yet know they were about to be proven wrong for the next 27 years. The Navy accepted the Skyraider into service in 1946, designated the AD-1. Arriving just months after the war, it was designed to fight had already ended. By the time production wound down in 1957, Douglas had built roughly 3,180 Skyraiders across a dozen distinct variants, and production run that would have been unthinkable for an aircraft anyone in 1944 expected to be obsolete within a few years of the jet engine's arrival. The adoption numbers told their own story. The U.S. Navy flew it as its primary carrier-based attack aircraft through the entire Korean War and deep into Vietnam. The U.S. Air Force, which had no propeller aircraft of its own suited to the kind of low and slow warfare Southeast Asia demanded, eventually acquired the type as well, a decision that would take nearly 2 decades to arrive, and one this script will return to. The Republic of Vietnam Air Force flew Skyraiders as a frontline strike aircraft for years. France flew them in Algeria. Britain adapted a version as a carrier-based radar picket. An aircraft designed to solve one Navy's problem in 1944 ended up solving 4 different Air Force's problems for the next 3 decades. The records it set were not subtle. On June 20th, 1965, 4 Navy A-1H Sky Raiders from Attack Squadron 25, the Fist of the Fleet, were flying rescue cover over North Vietnam when 2 Soviet-built MiG-17 jet fighters jumped them. Lieutenant Clinton Johnson and Lieutenant Charles Hartman III didn't run. They turned into the MiGs, and in a near head-on pass, their combined 20mm cannon fire brought one of the jets down. A propeller-driven attack aircraft, designed 21 years earlier as a naval bomber, had just shot down a supersonic-capable jet fighter in air-to-air combat. It happened again on October 9, 1966, when Lieutenant William Patton of VA-176, flying from the USS Intrepid, outturned 4 MiG-17s and destroyed one of them, the last time in history a propeller-driven aircraft would down a jet in aerial combat. By the mid-1960s, the Navy and Air Force were both fielding the aircraft's intended successors, the Grumman A-6 Intruder and the LTV A-7 Corsair II, both jets, both faster, both representing the future the Sky Raider was supposed to have already yielded to. The Sky Raider kept flying anyway, because speed had never been the argument for keeping it in service. Endurance was. A Sky Raider could loiter over a target for hours on a single fuel load, carrying up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance, a bomb load that rivaled a World War II-era B-17 bomber, delivered by a single-seat attack aircraft the size of a large fighter. That combination, endurance, payload, and the ability to fly low and slow without stalling, was about to matter more than anyone in 1944 could have predicted, in a war fought not at 30,000 feet, but at treetop level, over jungle, in support of men on the ground who needed an aircraft that could see them. You are 29 years old and your name is Bernard Fisher. It is March 10, 1966, and you are flying an A-1E Sky Raider, call sign Hobo 51, low over the A Shau Valley in South Vietnam, a mile from the Laotian border. Below you, a Special Forces camp is being overrun by more than 2,000 North Vietnamese regulars. You already know what this valley costs. You were awarded the Silver Star for flying cover here yesterday. Today you're back because the camp still hasn't fallen, and your fellow Sky Raider pilots are still in the air, looking for a hole in the solid cloud ceiling pressing down on the hilltops around you. You find the hole. You and your wingman drop through it, down into the valley, 6 miles from the camp, flying low enough to see individual muzzle flashes in the tree line. Then you hear it over the radio. One of your own has gone down. Major Dafford, Jump Myers, call sign Hobo 28, hit and forced to crash land on the camp's own cratered airstrip, 200 yards from advancing enemy troops. A rescue helicopter is 30 minutes out. Myers doesn't have 30 minutes. You make the decision before you finish the thought. You drop toward a runway littered with debris and burning wreckage, under fire the entire way down, and you land, dodging craters, dodging the wreck of Myers' own aircraft, and taxi toward the place you think he's hiding. He breaks from cover, climbs onto your wing under continuing enemy fire, and you haul him headfirst into the seat beside you. Then you push the throttle forward and take off from a runway that was never meant to launch anything again, climbing out of the valley as ground fire chases you the entire way. Mechanics count 19 bullet holes in your aircraft when you land at Pleiku. For that landing, Bernard Fisher received the Medal of Honor, the first awarded to an airman in the Vietnam War. Jump Myers survived. The camp fell to North Vietnamese forces later that same day, but the air support that had held the line long enough allowed rescue helicopters to pull out the surviving defenders. No jet in the American inventory could have flown that mission. None could slow down enough to land on a strip that short, absorb that kind of ground fire and keep flying, or loiter low enough over jungle to find one man hiding from an army. That was the argument for the Sky Raider, proven in the worst possible circumstances by a pilot who trusted an airplane designed 22 years earlier over anything faster sitting on the same flight line. But even as Fisher's Sky Raider became a legend, the fleet it flew from was changing underneath it. Aircraft carriers built and refitted through the 1960s were being reconfigured around jet fuel. The kerosene-based fuel burned by the A-6 and A-7, the Navy was already flying alongside the Skyraider. Aviation gasoline, the fuel the Skyraider's right radial engine had always run on, needed its own separate tankage, its own separate handling, its own separate space below decks. Every gallon of gas carried for the Skyraider was tank capacity a carrier couldn't give to the jets replacing it. The Skyraider hadn't lost a single argument it could win with performance. The argument that was about to end its career wasn't going to be fought in the air at all. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph P. Dunn flew with Attack Squadron 25, the same fist of the fleet that had made history less than 3 years earlier, the same squadron whose pilots had turned into a pair of MiG-17s over North Vietnam and proven a propeller-driven attack aircraft could kill a jet in the air. Dunn was a Skyraider pilot in that same squadron's lineage, flying the same aircraft that had already written itself into naval aviation legend. On February 14, 1968, Dunn was on a ferry flight, moving his A-1H from Naval Air Station QB Point in the Philippines toward the carrier USS Coral Sea. The flight path took him near Hainan Island, Chinese territory, and sources differ on exactly how close he strayed and what intercepted him. Some accounts record a Chinese MiG-17, others a MiG-19. What the record agrees on is the outcome. Dunn was shot down and killed. There was no rescue this time. No second Skyraider dropping through a break in the clouds to find him. No cratered airstrip to land on, no wingman to cover the extraction. A ferry flight, a wrong heading near a hostile coastline, and a jet fighter that gave him no chance to turn into it the way Johnson and Hartman had turned into their MiGs in 1965. The irony sits in the squadron patch on his shoulder. VA-25 was the unit that had proven, in the most public and celebrated way possible, that this aircraft could beat a jet in the air. Less than 3 years after that victory, the same squadron lost one of its own pilots to the exact kind of enemy it had once triumphed over. Not in a dogfight this squadron chose to fight, but in a moment of navigation error near a coastline that offered no margin for one. Dunn's death carries no medal, no headline, no place in the aircraft's highlight reel. It carries only a name, a date, and a squadron patch that had already written a different, more famous chapter in the very same war. The institution that eventually saved the Skyraider's combat career had only a few years earlier refused to fly it at all. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, the United States Air Force possessed no propeller-driven aircraft suited to the kind of war brewing in Southeast Asia. Slow, low altitude, close to the ground, fought in support of small units that needed an aircraft able to loiter overhead and see them, not scream past at supersonic speed. The Air Force's entire institutional identity by this point was built around jets, fighter wings, bomber wings, an officer corps that had spent a decade rising through jet cockpits. The propeller-driven attack aircraft was, in the culture of the service, a relic from a war that was already over. That culture had a name and an origin. Air Force doctrine through the 1950s had organized itself almost entirely around strategic jet air power, nuclear deterrence, high-altitude bombing, and fighter interceptors built for speed over endurance. An aircraft that flew low, flew slow, and carried a single pilot into small arms range of the enemy didn't fit the institutional picture the Air Force had built of itself. It didn't fit the career track. It didn't fit the procurement priorities. For years, it simply wasn't considered. The counterinsurgency war in Vietnam didn't care what the Air Force's culture preferred. By 1961 and 1962, American advisors on the ground were reporting the same problem again and again. Jets moved too fast to find and support small units fighting in dense jungle, and the Air Force had nothing else in its inventory built for the job. In April 1962, the Air Force finally established a Special Air Warfare Center at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida to test aircraft for the counterinsurgency role it had spent a decade ignoring. The service tested B-26 bombers left over from an earlier war. It tested T-28 trainers modified for light attack, and, almost as an afterthought, it tested 2 Navy Skyraiders on loan, the same aircraft that had already been flying combat missions with the Navy and the South Vietnamese Air Force for years. The results of that evaluation, completed by January 1963, were unambiguous. The Skyraider could perform nearly every mission counterinsurgency warfare demanded. It could carry the ordnance. It could loiter over a target. It could absorb ground fire and keep flying. The aircraft the Air Force had never bothered to consider turned out to be better suited to the job than anything already sitting on its own flight lines. Douglas A-1 Sky Raider, Ed Heinemann, Chapter 7, Part 2. Even after the evidence was in, the Air Force moved carefully, acquiring roughly 150 surplus two-seat A-1E Sky Raiders from Navy stocks, overhauling them, and adding dual flight controls, so American pilots trained on jets could be converted onto piston engine flying while training South Vietnamese air crews at the same time. The first of those aircraft weren't delivered to the Air Force until April 1963, nearly a full year after the Eglin tests had already proven the aircraft could do the job. It would be May 1964 before the 1st Air Commando Squadron flew Sky Raiders into combat from Bien Hoa Air Base under the call sign Hobo, the same call sign Bernard Fisher would carry into the A Shau Valley less than 2 years later. That delay cost time. The war in Vietnam did not have to spare. Every year between the counterinsurgency crisis, American advisors were already reporting, and the Air Force's first combat Sky Raider sortie was a year the service spent flying jets that couldn't do the job its own pilots on the ground needed done. Then, having spent years reluctant to adopt the aircraft at all, the Air Force and Navy both began moving to retire it, not because it had stopped performing, but because the institutional tide the Sky Raider had been swimming against since 1944 was catching up with it from a different direction. Aircraft carriers were being reconfigured for the jet fuel logistics the A-6 Intruder and A-7 Corsair II required. Every gallon of aviation gasoline the Sky Raider needed was tankage the fleet increasingly couldn't spare. By 1968, the Navy's last Sky Raider combat squadrons were flying their final cruises. The Air Force held on longer, leaning on the aircraft's unmatched loiter time and rugged airframe for the sandy search and rescue role that fast jets simply could not fly. But by the early 1970s, the Cessna A-37 Dragonfly and the A-7 were taking over even that mission. The Sky Raider was never defeated by an enemy pilot in the way its jet age doctrine had once predicted it would be. It was defeated by fuel tank capacity, procurement timelines, and a service culture that had resisted adopting it in the first place, and then, once it had proven itself irreplaceable in combat, quietly began planning its replacement anyway. Ed Heinemann's exit from Douglas Aircraft was never dramatic enough to draw its own headline, and that is exactly the point. In 1960, after 24 years running engineering at the company that had once fired him within a year of hiring him, Heinemann left Douglas to join Guidance Technology. There was no scandal behind it, no boardroom fight, no forced resignation. He simply moved on, the way a man moves on from a job he has already mastered, toward the next problem worth solving. 2 years later, in 1962, he joined General Dynamics as Corporate Vice President of Engineering, a position from which he would oversee early development of the F-16 before retiring in 1973. The official story is a career, cleanly told. Draftsman to chief engineer to corporate vice president, more than 20 military aircraft to his name, a retirement earned on his own terms. The real story is quieter, and it runs on a different clock than his career did. Heinemann left Douglas in 1960. The Sky Raider's most famous chapters hadn't been written yet. Bernard Fisher's landing in the A Shau Valley was 6 years away. The MiG-17 kills over North Vietnam were still 5 years off. The Sandy call sign that would make the aircraft synonymous with combat rescue didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be coined until late 1965. Every moment that turned the Sky Raider from a solid attack aircraft into a legend happened after the man who designed it had already walked out the door and moved on to General Dynamics. There is no mechanism of loss here in the way institutions usually take something from an engineer. No board vote, no seized patent, no rival claiming credit in a press release. What Heinemann lost was simpler and harder to point to. He lost the timing. The aircraft became famous under names that weren't his. Pilots called it the Spad. They called it Able Dog. They called it Sandy. Newspapers and after-action reports named the pilots who flew it into the history books: Fisher, Johnson, Hartman, Patton, because those were the names actually in the cockpit when the aircraft did the things that made it legendary. Heinemann's name sat on an engineering drawing from 1944, 20 years removed from the missions that made the airplane immortal. This is not erasure by malice. No institution moved to strip his name from the record. It is erasure by distance. The ordinary, undramatic way a designer's name recedes from a machine's story once the machine starts making its own headlines, flown by men whose names the moment actually belonged to. Heinemann did not disappear. He kept working, kept designing, kept climbing. General Dynamics, the F-16 program, a retirement in 1973 that closed out one of the longest and most productive careers in American military aviation. He was never bitter about it in any way the public record shows. But ask the average American in 1968, watching footage of a propeller-driven aircraft rescuing a downed pilot under fire in Vietnam, who designed the machine making that rescue possible, and the honest answer is, almost no one could have told you. That is the quiet cost of the pivot he made in 1944. He built an aircraft good enough to outlive its own designer's visibility. By the time the Skyraider entered its most celebrated decade of combat, the man who designed it was 3,000 miles away, running an engineering division at General Dynamics that had nothing to do with attack aircraft anymore. Everything the Skyraider became famous for in Vietnam, it became famous for without him. The Sandy Combat Search and Rescue mission is the clearest example. Coined almost by accident in late 1965, Captain J.W. Doc George simply chose it as a departure call sign, and it stuck to every Skyraider flying rescue cover after him. Sandy became one of the most trusted call signs of the entire war. A-1 pilots flying as Sandy would arrive over a downed airman first, locate him, mark and suppress enemy positions with cannon fire and rockets, then escort the rescue helicopter in and out of hostile territory for as long as it took. No jet in the American inventory could fly that mission. A fast jet had only minutes of loiter time before fuel forced it home, and its speed made it nearly useless for picking a single hidden man out of dense jungle. The Skyraider could circle for hours, fly slow enough to actually see the ground, and carry enough ordnance to keep an entire hillside suppressed while a helicopter worked its way in. On September 1, 1968, Lieutenant Colonel William A. Jones III flew that mission near Dong Hoi, North Vietnam, searching for a downed F-4 Phantom pilot under heavy anti-aircraft fire. An explosion beneath his A-1H filled his cockpit with smoke. Badly burned, he kept searching anyway, found the downed pilot's position, and radioed it to the rest of the rescue force before flying his damaged aircraft home. He would receive the Medal of Honor for that mission, one of the war's clearest demonstrations of exactly what the Skyraider's endurance and toughness were built to do. None of it ran through Heinemann. Not the call sign, not the tactics, not the men who flew it. By 1968, he had been gone from Douglas for 8 years. The record credits the men in the cockpits, and it should. Bernard Fisher's name is the one attached to the A Shao Valley Rescue. William Jones's name is the one attached to Dong Hoi. Clinton Johnson, Charles Hartman, and William Patton are the names history remembers for the MiG kills, not the engineer whose airframe made those kills possible 20 years after he drew it. That is not an injustice done to Heinemann. It is simply how credit works in combat. The man flying the mission earns the story, and the man who built the machine, 2 decades earlier, recedes into a footnote on a specification sheet. The most public moment of credit passing to someone else came wrapped in irony the aircraft itself had earned. When Premier Nguyen Cao Ky of South Vietnam, himself a former Skyraider pilot, heard that VA-25's pilots had shot down a MiG-17 in June 1965, he insisted the Navy pilots be flown to Saigon as his personal guests, where he awarded them Vietnamese pilots' wings and honorary commissions in the South Vietnamese Air Force. The moment belonged entirely to the men in the cockpits and the head of state who had once flown the same aircraft himself. Heinemann's name did not come up. The company that built the aircraft didn't escape the same forward motion either. Douglas Aircraft, the company Heinemann had given 24 years of his career, merged with McDonnell Aircraft in 1967 to form McDonnell Douglas, a new corporate identity, absorbing the old one, the same way the Skyraider's legend had absorbed the name of the man who designed it. Douglas the company and Heinemann the engineer both became foundations other names were built on top of. What the Skyraider proved, mission after mission, through 1968 and into the early 1970s, was that Heinemann's original bet, one pilot, one engine, stripped of everything the formula didn't strictly need, had been right in ways even he couldn't have fully predicted in that Washington hotel room in 1944. He built an airplane that could still save lives in a war fought 2 decades after its first flight, flown by pilots who would become the names history remembers, over an airplane whose own designer's name had already quietly receded from the story. Follow the corporate line far enough, and it leads somewhere. Every American watching this video would recognize immediately. Douglas Aircraft, the company that gave an 18-year-old draftsman his first job, and then, 24 years later, watched him leave for General Dynamics, merged with McDonnell Aircraft in 1967 to become McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas itself was absorbed into Boeing in 1997. The company that built an aircraft in a single overnight design session in 1944 is now, 3 mergers later, folded into the largest aerospace manufacturer in the United States. Heinemann's own path ran in parallel, from Douglas to General Dynamics in 1962, where he spent the final decade of his career overseeing early engineering work on the F-16 Fighting Falcon, a jet still flying combat missions in American service today. A design philosophy born from stripping a failing 2-man bomber down to its bones in one desperate night carried, through 2 corporate mergers and 1 career change, into an aircraft still on the front lines of American air power more than 80 years later. But the number that carries the emotional weight of this story isn't a merger date. It's a man on a burning airstrip who never expected to see a Sky Raider land next to him. Jump Myers had already accepted he wasn't getting out of the Ashau Valley alive. His own account of that morning, given afterward, is almost unbearably specific. He crawled away from his burning aircraft, certain the enemy would search there first. He ran into a minefield and crawled back the way he came. I said to myself, Myers, you have really had it now, he remembered later. The last thought on my mind was rescue. I knew a chopper would never survive to ground fire, and it simply never occurred to me that somebody would be crazy enough to put an A-1E down on that strip. Nobody in that valley was thinking about rescue. Myers wasn't. The North Vietnamese troops closing in on his position certainly weren't planning for it, and by every reasonable calculation available to a downed pilot hiding in a minefield under fire, no aircraft in the American inventory should have been able to reach him, let alone land next to him and take off again. Bernard Fisher did exactly that. Not because doctrine called for it, not because it was the mission he'd been assigned that morning, but because the airplane underneath him, stripped down to 1 seat and 1 engine by a man who had never flown combat himself, gave him a chance no jet in the theater could have offered. Myers lived because an engineer in 1944 had decided a 2-man attack bomber carried more weight than the mission actually required and cut it down to something that could survive doing what no aircraft its size was ever expected to do 22 years later. That story, a downed pilot certain rescue was impossible, saved by the one aircraft built rugged and slow enough to attempt it, is the wild card this format calls for, and it isn't an accident that it involves the Sky Raider twice over. The same design decisions that let Fisher land on a cratered strip and fly out under fire are the same decisions that let the aircraft loiter for hours, absorb battle damage, and keep flying home when a jet would have already gone down. Heinemann never met Jump Myers. He never knew this specific mission would happen when he was cutting weight off a bomb bay in 1944. But every pound he stripped from that airframe became, decades later, the margin of survival for a man hiding in a minefield who had already given up. Universe Link, placeholder. Kanban Saknyeon Chudae number 2 trong pipeline. SBD Dauntless A4 Skyhawk, hay máy bay Heinemann nào khác? Để tôi viết đoạn link chính thức tại đây, nêu tên nhân vật hoặc máy bay liên kết cụ thể theo đúng rule, chỉ dùng liên kết đã có tư liệu xác thực. Thôi để trong phần này để không vi phạm nguyên tắc, no invented cross-episode links. Ed Heinemann spent 47 years designing aircraft, and by the time he died on November 26, 1991, at the age of 83, more than 20 of his designs had entered military service. Dive bombers, attack bombers, fighters, supersonic research aircraft, and one single-seat attack aircraft that outlived every prediction made about it in 1944. He was inducted into the ranks of aviation's most influential designers, not because any one of his airplanes was the fastest or the most advanced, but because his airplanes kept doing their jobs long after faster, more advanced aircraft had already been retired around them. The Sky Raider was the clearest proof of that philosophy the U.S. military ever fielded. It went to war twice, Korea, then Vietnam, flew for 4 different air forces, killed 2 jet fighters in air-to-air combat with a propeller engine built in 1944, and saved men like Jump Myers who had already stopped believing rescue was possible. It did all of that while the institution that eventually depended on it spent years refusing to fly it at all. Douglas A-1, Sky Raider, Ed Heinemann, Chapter 11. He got the airplane right. That much the record settles beyond argument. An aircraft designed in one desperate night in 1944, built to replace a failing 2-man bomber, ended up outflying, outlasting, and outfighting every jet sent to retire it for the next 27 years. What he didn't get, and couldn't have controlled, was the timing of his own exit. He left Douglas in 1960, 6 years before the airplane's most famous chapters were even flown, and the world remembered the pilots who lived those chapters far more than the engineer who made them survivable. They took his name off the story. They could never take the airplane off the mission. The next time you see that stubby radial engine silhouette in an old photograph, bombs slung under its wings, smoke trailing from some jungle hillside below it, think about a man who spent one sleepless night in a Washington hotel room deciding that less weight meant more airplane, and never lived to see most of what that decision would save.